They told you to be a man, but never showed you how. They said love would find you, but never warned you about projection. They celebrated feminine energy, but forgot to teach what it means to integrate it. Somewhere between porn addiction, ghosting culture, and emotional illiteracy, men became strangers to their own anima, and women became the battlefield for that ignorance. This isn't about blaming society. It's about waking up, fast, because every man walking around with a broken relationship to his inner feminine is living someone else's myth and bleeding it into every woman he meets. What if the chaos in your love life wasn't random? What if the women you chase, adore, or fear are actually mirrors? Not of them, but of you. Carl Jung didn't write Aion to sound clever. He gave us a map to the soul, where the anima isn't a fantasy, but a force. A force that either hijacks your life through projection or liberates you through individuation. And if you've ever felt like you fall too fast, feel too lost, or love too hard, this map was made for you. In this video, we'll dismantle the illusions, explore the archetypes, and pull back the psychic curtain on your deepest emotional patterns. No fluff, no sugarcoating, just straight-up psychological fire, drawn from Jung's legacy and forged in real-life dynamics. Because once you meet your anima, you'll never meet women the same way again. And maybe, just maybe, that's where your real journey begins. Chapter 1. The Anima and Animus. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that parts of who we are remain hidden beneath the surface, operating silently in the background. Carl Jung wasn't just theorizing when he introduced the Anima and Animus. He was giving us a roadmap to meet the unseen forces inside us. The Anima represents the feminine within the male psyche, and the Animus, the masculine within the female. These archetypes, deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, aren't just poetic symbols. They shape how we perceive the opposite sex, ourselves, and the roles we play in relationships. For men, the anima often emerges in dreams, fantasies, and intense emotional reactions to women. You know that moment when a man meets a woman and feels like she's everything he's ever wanted. Even though he barely knows her, that's not love. That's projection. It's his personal unconscious casting the feminine image it's been hiding all along. Similarly, for women, the animus can appear as the inner critic, the know-it-all voice, or even as a rebellious force demanding independence. These figures aren't random. They're built from myths, family dynamics, and society's expectations of gender roles. This dynamic plays out in real life more than people realize. Imagine a man who constantly falls for manic pixie dream girls, or a woman drawn to bad boys who never stick around. These aren't just bad luck. They're unconscious patterns, shaped by archetypes and fueled by projection making. The key to breaking free is individuation, the process of integrating these inner figures, understanding what they mean, and reclaiming parts of the self we've buried. It's not easy, but the reward is clarity, both in how we love and how we live. Books like Iron John by Robert Bly or Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes are gold mines when it comes to navigating these internal characters. They take you beyond stereotypes and into the rich symbolic terrain where real transformation begins. Whether you're a man learning to listen to his emotions without shame, or a woman claiming her voice in a world that's long tried to mute it, this work is where self-development stops being a buzzword and starts being a journey. But here's the kicker. These inner forces don't stay quiet forever. If we don't confront them, they show up in our relationships, careers, and even dreams, often causing chaos. The anima and animus aren't meant to be repressed or ignored. They're meant to be understood and integrated. And as we begin to see the shadow they cast in our daily lives, we naturally step into the next territory, the power of projection, and how it shapes not only who we love, but how we see the world itself. Chapter 2. Projection and the Shadow. Projection is one of the most deceptive tricks the mind plays on us. Jung knew this well. He described projection as the process by which we disown parts of ourselves, often hidden in the shadow, and see them in other people. When a man meets a woman who seems almost divine, chances are he's not seeing her clearly. He's seeing his anima, his inner feminine, reflected outward. The same happens when a woman meets a man she thinks is strong, assertive, and wise. That's often the animus talking. Projection is sneaky because it feels real. The shadow complicates all this. It holds the traits we've rejected, ignored, or feared. So instead of facing our insecurity, we project it onto others and call them weak. Instead of admitting our aggression, we see others as hostile. The anima and animus feed these projections too, by coloring how we experience the opposite sex. It's like walking around with a filter over our eyes, one we didn't even know we were wearing. Until we do shadow work, we keep falling into the same traps, idealizing, demonizing, misjudging, and calling it truth. Think of the guy who falls head over heels, only to blame the woman for changing later. Or the woman who dates emotionally unavailable man, convinced she can fix them. These are projections in action, driven by archetypes and distorted by unexamined patterns. Want to break the cycle? Start writing a projection journal. Each time someone triggers you, good or bad, ask, what part of me am I seeing in them? This practice sounds simple, but it cuts deep, and it's one of the most effective tools in self-development. Projection isn't just personal, it's cultural. Society projects collective, unconscious content onto celebrities, political figures, and public enemies. This explains why people either worship or demonize leaders with almost religious fervor. We're not just reacting to the person, we're reacting to what they awaken inside us. That's the power of archetypes. They slip into our consciousness through stories, media, even the way we interpret myths. And unless we recognize them, we'll keep living out their scripts without even realizing who wrote them. The deeper you go into projection, the more obvious it becomes. You're not just relating to others, you're relating to yourself, disguised as someone else. And that's where true individuation begins. When you stop outsourcing your light and your darkness, you start owning both. But what happens when the very first projection we ever experience, our bond with the mother, sets the tone for how we relate to love, power, and the feminine itself? Chapter 3. Oedipus and the mother-son relationship. Every man's first love story is silent, primal, and almost invisible to the conscious mind. It begins with a mother. Jung, along with Freud before him, understood that this bond forms the foundation of a man's emotional world. But while Freud focused on the literal Oedipus complex, Jung went deeper, revealing how the mother becomes an archetype, both nurturing and overpowering. The mother imago, buried deep in the personal unconscious, becomes the blueprint for what love should feel like. And if not confronted, it quietly dictates a man's romantic and psychological fate. The challenge is subtle yet powerful. How does a man grow without betraying the very figure who gave him life? Many stay stuck in that emotional umbilical cord, seeking in women the same comfort, care, and containment they once received from their mother. But what begins as love can become dependency. A man overly bound to the maternal world often lacks the animus of action, drive, and clear boundaries. He hesitates in decision-making, avoids confrontation, and retreats when life demands assertiveness. This isn't weakness, it's arrested development. In practical terms, this shows up in patterns. Men who can't commit, who crumble under responsibility, or who unconsciously sabotage relationships once they get too serious. Often, they're not afraid of the woman. They're afraid of separating from the inner mother she unconsciously represents. That's why real growth demands symbolic death. The man must leave the mother's psychic womb and face the chaos of the world on his own. Books like Understanding Masculine Psychology by Robert A. Johnson help illuminate this journey in ways that feel personal and transformative. But don't get it twisted. The mother isn't the enemy. She's the first mirror, the first archetype, the first taste of love. The danger lies in mistaking the comfort of childhood for the path of adulthood. The hero's journey begins the moment a man looks at the world and says, "This is mine to face." And that path is anything but easy. It's filled with rejection, loss, and uncertainty. But it's the only way to build true masculinity, not as dominance, but as grounded, integrated presence. This inner transformation is the foundation of individuation. A man who fails to leave the mother psychologically may still succeed outwardly, but his relationships will carry a hidden wound. His anima remains bound to the mother imago, and his shadow, full of unexpressed masculinity, festers beneath the surface. The call, then, is clear. Face the world, separate from the mother, and embrace the trials that forge the self. And this very trial is what begins the hero's journey. Chapter 4. Hero's Journey in Masculinity. The hero's journey isn't just a myth from ancient texts. It's a roadmap hidden in every man's psyche, waiting for activation. Jung knew this journey intimately. It starts with separation. The moment a man leaves the comfort of the maternal realm and steps into the unknown. This rite of passage isn't marked by fireworks. It's often triggered by crisis. A breakup, a betrayal, a sudden failure. Life shouts, "Grow up." And suddenly, you're no longer the boy. You're the man who must confront his animus, his shadow, and the world beyond. At this stage, the masculine isn't about bravado. It's about endurance. Think of Odysseus braving the sea, or Neo waking up from the Matrix. These aren't just action heroes. They're metaphors for psychological awakening. The hero doesn't win by force. He wins by transformation. He faces inner chaos, wrestles with projection, and returns home changed. That's the real test of masculinity. Not domination, but integration. The ability to hold pain, make meaning, and serve something greater than ego. You see this journey everywhere. The man who gives up porn and meaningless sex to find depth in relationship. The guy who walks away from a toxic job to pursue purpose, not just a paycheck. These are modern initiations. They look mundane from the outside, but internally, they're epic. They require shedding the mother's voice in his head. Be safe, stay small, don't risk. Masculinity isn't the opposite of femininity. It's the courage to step into fear and grow beyond the known. And yes, it's terrifying. The world doesn't hand out medals for inner battles. But that's the beauty of it. The real man doesn't need validation. He builds his value through action, through self-discipline, through self-development, through facing the collective, unconscious within. He stops blaming the world and starts mastering himself. This kind of masculinity isn't toxic. It's sacred. It holds space for others, leads with integrity, and owns its shadow without projecting it onto women, authority figures, or society. As the hero evolves, so does his relationship to femininity. He stops idealizing. He stops blaming. He sees women not as saviors or sirens, but as fellow travelers. And in doing so, his anima begins to mature, reflecting not the mother, but the muse, the inner guide toward balance and self-realization. Yet as society shifts its stance on gender roles and expectations, one has to wonder, how does this hero's path unfold in a world increasingly dominated by nurturing softness over demanding growth? Chapter 5. Gender Dynamics and Feminization of Society. There's a quiet shift happening in the collective unconscious, subtle but undeniable. The rise of nurturing environments, emotional safety, and inclusivity has brought us many blessings. But Jung would remind us, every archetype casts a shadow. When society leans too far into the maternal, protective energy, the risk is a softening of the masculine edge needed for growth. Masculinity, in its healthy form, isn't domination. It's the capacity to face discomfort, take responsibility, and endure chaos without collapsing. And in a world padded with safe spaces, that muscle can atrophy. Let's be clear, emotional intelligence, empathy, and communication are essential, but so are assertiveness, drive, and boundary setting. When society elevates only one side of the polarity, often femininity, masculinity can become pathologized. Boys are told to be nice, don't fight, stay still, while their natural animus energy gets shamed or medicated. The danger isn't women rising, it's men forgetting how to rise themselves. When masculinity is equated with toxicity, young men grow up confused, repressed, and often resentful. You can feel it in men who avoid conflict at all costs, in those who ghost rather than face difficult conversations, or in those paralyzed by indecision. This isn't evil, it's uninitiated. It's the boy still waiting for permission to step into the hero's journey. Without rites of passage, without mentorship, masculinity becomes a ghost archetype, present but undeveloped. That's why works like King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore are vital. They restore the masculine archetypes that offer direction, depth, and dignity. This doesn't mean rejecting femininity. It means honoring both poles. Masculinity and femininity aren't enemies. They're complements. Individuation demands integration, not imbalance. If the feminine is the ocean, the masculine is the vessel that moves across it. We need both. But when societal expectations strip men of their animus drive, or mock their desire for challenge, power dynamics warp. Projection intensifies. The shadow swells. And the result? Adults who never truly grow up, still looking for external permission to act. And here lies the challenge of our age. How do we reclaim true masculinity in a culture that subtly discourages it? How do we honor the mother archetype without letting it devour the animus within? These are the silent questions echoing in the hearts of countless men. And the answers, as always, lie in the paradoxical nature of the feminine itself. Chapter 6. The Dual Nature of the Feminine. The feminine is no gentle, one-dimensional archetype. It is, by nature, paradoxical. Jung understood that the feminine, when projected outward or encountered within, carries both the nurturing softness of the Great Mother and the consuming force of the devouring Mother. On one hand, she heals, feeds, and consoles. On the other, she constricts, overprotects, and engulfs. Most men don't realize they're dancing with both aspects until it's too late. One moment she's amused, the next, she's a storm. And if that sounds like every intense relationship you've had, well, welcome to the club. These dual aspects aren't just types of women. They're archetypal expressions within the male psyche, shaped by early mother-son dynamics and reinforced by projection. A man who hasn't confronted the shadow side of femininity will either idealize women or resent them. He'll crave comfort but fear commitment. He'll seek softness but feel smothered by it. That's not about her. It's about him. His anima is fragmented. And until he integrates both faces of the feminine, he'll keep repeating the same emotional script over and over. This is why some men stay in relationships that drain them. They confuse being devoured with being loved. They think suffering is part of connection. Others, terrified of being controlled, avoid intimacy altogether. Both are trapped in projection. The real work is learning to hold space for the feminine without losing the self, recognizing when the archetype is speaking and when it's time to step back. Reading Jung's Aion or exploring myths like Persephone and Demeter can give you the symbolic language needed to navigate this terrain consciously. For women, this duality plays out too. Many struggle to balance tenderness with boundaries, care with autonomy. They often internalize the same projections men cast, trying to be mother, lover, therapist, and savior all at once. But no one can embody all archetypes without distortion. The pressure creates burnout, resentment, and self-abandonment. Recognizing these archetypes allows both men and women to step out of unconscious roles and meet each other as whole beings, not mythological fragments. Understanding the feminine isn't about worship or fear, it's about respect. It's about seeing the complexity beneath the surface and engaging with it consciously. Because once a man stops projecting his anima and starts integrating her, something changes. The illusions fade, the fantasies fall, and in their place, real sexual dynamics begin to emerge, unfiltered, unidealized, and deeply human. Chapter 7: Sexual Dynamics and Projection. Let's talk about the elephant in the bedroom: projection and sexual dynamics. It's wild how often we confuse lust with love, fantasy with reality, and anima with actual women. Jung knew that sexuality, when entangled with unconscious projection, becomes a playground for illusion. A man doesn't just desire a woman. He desires what she symbolizes to his psyche. She becomes the embodiment of everything he's disowned: passion, mystery, comfort, even salvation. And when she fails to meet the script he unknowingly wrote for her, the disappointment hits like betrayal. This happens every day. A man idolizes a woman's beauty, grace, or sensuality, convinced she's the one. But it's not her he's seeing. It's his anima dressed in her skin. The projection is intoxicating, but fragile. The moment she acts human, messy, moody, complex, the illusion collapses. He withdraws, criticizes, or spirals into confusion. And unless he realizes the projection at play, he repeats the cycle. That's why real intimacy begins where projection ends. When we stop demanding perfection and start relating soul to soul. Women experience this too. The animus, often projected onto men, becomes the fantasy of the strong, assertive, successful protector. But when that man shows vulnerability or confusion, he's labeled weak or disappointing. These projections don't just harm relationships, they sabotage them before they begin. One way to break free is through conscious self-inquiry. Next time you feel overwhelmingly drawn to someone, pause and ask, what need is this person fulfilling in my psyche? What aspect of myself have I outsourced to them? Sexual dynamics become rich and real when both partners stop playing archetypal roles and meet in presence. That requires emotional maturity, shadow work, and brutal honesty. Practices like Tantra or Jungian active imagination can help explore the animus and anima directly, beyond fantasy. Books like Intimate Communion by David Deida or The Eden Project by James Hollis offer maps for navigating this terrain with depth. Because let's face it, sex without consciousness is just projection in motion, fleeting, repetitive, and hollow. But when you strip away the projections, when the shadow has been acknowledged and the archetypes integrated, something deeper emerges. Desire no longer seeks rescue or validation. It becomes an expression of wholeness, not a cry for completion. And in this state, the myths we've lived out unconsciously start to dissolve, making space for a new kind of connection, rooted not in fantasy, but in truth. A connection shaped not just by psyche, but by the very archetypes that wrote our oldest stories. Chapter 8: The role of myths and archetypes in understanding gender. Myths aren't just bedtime stories from ancient civilizations. They're blueprints of the psyche. Jung saw them as echoes of the collective unconscious, revealing deep truths about our inner lives. When it comes to gender, myths give us symbolic language to understand the complex dance between anima and animus, masculinity and femininity. Take Oedipus, for instance, not as a literal tale of maternal desire, but as a metaphor for the soul's entanglement with the mother archetype. These stories help us name what we feel, even when we can't quite explain it. Every culture has its Eve, its Lilith, its Aphrodite. These feminine archetypes aren't about one woman. They're mirrors of the animus's projection and the ego's longing. The same goes for masculine figures. Zeus, Hercules, Shiva, all reflections of power, chaos, wisdom, and shadow. We don't just read myths, we live them. A man might chase career success, thinking he's being ambitious when he's actually reenacting the hero's journey. A woman might resist intimacy, believing she's strong, while her inner animus guards her against vulnerability. The point isn't to reduce ourselves to archetypes, but to become aware of how they shape our behavior. When you know you're reenacting Persephone or chasing the Grail, you gain agency. You stop being a puppet of unconscious forces and start becoming an author of your story. This doesn't mean rejecting the myths. It means reclaiming them, rereading them through a psychological lens. Not what happened, but what is this trying to show me? That's where the gold is buried. In meaning, not just metaphor. Modern gender confusion often stems from the collapse of myth. Without symbolic frameworks, we either cling to stereotypes or float in ambiguity. But when we study archetypes, we see that masculinity and femininity are not boxes. They're energies, roles, and rhythms. A man can be nurturing like Osiris and fierce like Ares. A woman can be intuitive like Isis and assertive like Athena. These archetypes live in all of us, waiting to be balanced, expressed, and honored, not repressed under societal expectations or confused by unconscious projection. So, as we revisit ancient myths, we're not stepping backward, we're stepping inward. We're decoding the psychic language of our ancestors to navigate today's complexities. Gender, sexuality, love, power, they've always been part of the human mythos. And now, with projection dissolved and archetypes integrated, we can begin to understand them not as roles to perform, but as forces to harmonize. That's the real initiation, living not as a character in someone else's myth, but as a fully realized self in your own. Conclusion. Take this knowledge and make it your practice. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't about theory. This is about your life, your relationships, your wounds, your anima. The question is, what are you going to do with all this insight? Will you keep playing out the same projections, repeating the same toxic cycles? Or will you finally face the mother imago, the shadow, and the stories that shaped you? Jung didn't hand us a manual. He handed us a mirror. Now it's your turn to look, really look, and stop blaming the world for the reflection. Because let's be honest, deep down, you've always known something was off. That your idea of love was distorted. That your masculinity felt muted, your femininity misunderstood. You felt the archetypes stirring. You've seen the patterns repeat like clockwork. The anima isn't out there. It's in you. But you have to stop chasing illusions. You have to stop projecting. You have to grow up. Not in a macho, ego-driven way, but in a soul-deep, world-shifting, spiritually awake kind of way. So here's your challenge. Take this knowledge and make it your practice. Start journaling. Study the myths. Observe your projections, rewrite your hero's journey, and most importantly, start relating from the self, not the shadow. You want love? Learn to love your own psyche first. You want freedom? Confront your own patterns. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and join this space of deep transformation. Because we're just getting started. And the next level, that's when you meet yourself for real.